I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and this is why card game players hate mill. There will be a couple of factors to consider here, some of them mechanical, some of them more on the thematic side, so let's get started. Starting with the first one, mill simply plays the game on a different axis. If your opponent's focus is on hitting you with creatures, they are in a good position to gauge how much effort, luck, and skill goes into you also hitting them with creatures. If you are attacking alongside a completely different axis, they are not in a great position to gauge what percentage of these factors was involved. As some players will tend to assume the worst in absence of evidence, this can lead to accusations of the deck and the strategy being your choice of brain-dead, flowcharty, overtuned, or whatever else. This may also apply to other alternate win conditions, of course. Let's say collectathon victories like Coalition Victory in MTG, though that one happened to actually be kind of overtuned in certain contexts, so maybe a better example would be Lyra Festival in Altered TCG. Most alternate win conditions, mill included, will put an opponent in that place of low empathy towards the player of these win cons, and that will paint them and the strategy in a negative light. Now, for a mill-specific element, since that last one was kind of generalized, there is that feeling one gets when they see a card they would have liked to play next turn, leave the top of their deck, go to the graveyard, never to be seen again. That feeling of being stopped from playing the milled card is often discounted as being a new player instinct, especially so in MTG, I find. And it makes a modicum of sense, since before the top card of my deck is revealed, I don't really have access to it either way. Until that happens, it's equally likely to be any card from my deck, the best one or the worst one. A sort of Schrodinger's card, if you will. It is not yet the card I would have liked to play until it's revealed, potentially via being milled. Unless I place that card there myself through an effect like Brainstorm or a sleight of hand technique known as cheating, of course. So even though the specific card is physically there and it is physically getting removed, it's kind of the same instinct as hoping I would have shuffled my deck differently. It would have probably put me in a materially better position, especially if my shuffling sucks, but it's not something I or the opponent had much control over, so it's probably not productive to focus on it too much. Still, this doesn't mean that having a card from your deck removed never matters. There is context to consider here. Let's say if the mill player was able to choose what they mill, and they consciously targeted the best cards in your deck, that would be a very different story. And a story like this might be written by decks like Magic the Gathering's Lantern Control, which causes the opponent to play with the top card of their deck revealed and mills it or allows it to be drawn depending on what it is. As you might imagine, the cards they allow the opponent to draw are mostly dead draws, like lands or cards that do nothing in the matchup. In that sense, it causes a very real and very justified sense of irritation connected to having your best cards removed, and that happens when your opponent does so consciously. However, another example we would like to consider is if they reach the same outcome, that is, removing your best card, through sheer luck. And that is kind of circling back to that first example that we discounted as newbie instinct. However, there are situations where that outcome is way more likely to happen. And both we the players and we the designers, have some control over how often these situations of higher likelihood will arise. We don't control the car that might hit us, but we choose whether or not we stand in the middle of the street, so to speak. I should be a writer. So, sure, there are cases where having your best card milled is not a huge consideration. That's the majority of constructed MTG, actually, where decks have a good bit of internal redundancy. They are playing a lot of 4-offs, they have multiple sets of 4-offs that accomplish similar things. Let's say if it's an aggressive deck, they probably have multiple sets of 4 that are attacking aggressively statted creatures. So even if one of those gets milled, let's say you had 16 of them in your deck out of the 40 cards remaining, Now that one got milled, you have 15 out of 39, which is not that much worse in terms of your likelihood of drawing one if you wanted to draw one for next turn. One being milled slightly increases the likelihood of the remaining 15 being drawn, so it's even less impactful than it might seem at first glance. Not a 2.5% decrease, 1 out of 16, but more of a 1.5%. But there are occasions that can contextually increase the likelihood of having a card milled be a big deal. Let's say I'm only running one of win conditions in my deck, without a way to recur them for the sake of the argument. And that can happen quite often if I'm playing a control deck, and I'm confident in my ability to prolong the game until I can draw into those one-offs. So I don't really need to include multiple copies, because I will eventually get access to the one that I have. Or if I'm playing a deck that relies on tutors to get specific cards out of my deck. I will also not need to include redundant copies, because I'll just tutor out the specific cards that I need. Then, mill is way more likely to work as a form of resource denial, much like it did for Lantern Control. However, since the cards milled here are still random, unlike for Lantern Control, it's not a form of resource denial that either player has much control over. But still, it's a potential surprise win condition against some of these decks. And remember, if you hit any of these cards, if you hit any of my payoffs, even if you don't nick up my deck fully, you will also decrease the power of the tutors that I use to get them out of the deck. A kind of 2-for-1. You not only remove a useful card, but also turn a tutor into a dead draw if it has nothing to get out of my deck. In card games like Pokemon, it's entirely possible for mill to turn off strategies that rely on tutoring up specific cards from their deck. Since all Pokemon decks are pretty much combo decks, they are often so fine-tuned that there is not much space left for redundancy. If you hit the 1 or 2 copies of a key card they have, they may just fold. Indeed, cards like Misfortune Sisters are run in heavy control decks like Snorlax Stall, which is a deck that wins by deck out technically, but not by proactively milling your opponent's deck, but rather by locking a useless Pokemon in your opponent's active zone and, passing the turn 60 times, causing them to run out of cards organically. Misfortune Sisters not necessarily run here to mill the opponent faster, to quicken the clock, though that is a bonus, but rather to lower the number of outs the opponents have. Cards like Canceling Cologne or switch cards that can allow them to get out from under the lock. Since most decks don't run that many copies of either, if you hit 1 or 2, you can change a potential loss into a very time-consuming win. So being an unexpected win condition against these low redundancy strategies, and being a win condition that often relies on randomly hitting the right cards, is another source of friction working against mill, especially in the eyes of players of these archetypes that are affected by it. And while that may sound somewhat healthy, I will be the first to agree that it does punish greedy deck building choices. There can often be rule sets, or even entire games, where one can't really add more redundancy into one's deck. Singleton formats like EDH, where playing more than one copy of a specific card is not a feasible way to add more redundancy, or, the entirety of Marvel Snap with its extremely small singleton decks. And that leads us neatly to another element I would like to consider. That mill is not really fought as much at the playing the match level, but rather during deck building. It both punishes and is in turn punished by deck building choices. This is not great for feeling like you have agency during the match, which I think is something that all card games should ideally strive for, because there's few things players hate more than feeling like they lost the match at its very start, just based on the matchup, but mill is generally fought in that deck building arena. Because first of all, it's rare for it to share counter cards with any other playstyle, it completely blanks life gain, it ignores defensive creatures. So most card games balance it by printing very powerful ways to combat it specifically, if you know to prepare for it, and include them at the deck building stage. Those will most often be extremely low tempo against everything else, but provide overwhelming amounts of value against mill specifically. A great example are Eldrazi Titans from MTG. You don't expect to play them that often since they are very expensive, but the mere inclusion of one of these in your deck causes a mill opponent to have to jump through so many additional hoops. On a different front, mill often coexists with other irritating mechanics. I blame Magic having mill primarily in blue, the color of counterspells that everybody hates, but even in games like Pokemon, I really got into Pokemon these past few months, not sure if you can tell by the way, Great Tusk Mill often plays one of stall pieces like Mimikyu or Cornerstone Ogre Pawn EX, and negative interaction like TM Devolution, Neutralization Zone, or Airy, often perceived as time-wasting or mean. Historical examples include Durant Mill playing Lost Remover and Crushing Hammer, also negative interaction intended to slow down the opponent, and this is kind of a feedback loop. Since mill is already perceived as irritating and a form of negative interaction, it's way more likely to be printed alongside other cards, factions, and classes that are, control, stall, or other things associated with negative interactions. Mill is also often present on effects that don't require you to keep up board presence. As such, it can come across as non-interactive, and in some cases it just is non-interactive. This is not a given, of course. Pokemon Mill tends to require you to have a Pokemon with the necessary move in the active zone, like Great Tusk here, allowing for it to be knocked out, but Magic Mill decks, for example, are often reliant on instant and sorcery cards, with some artifacts, enchantments, and creatures playing kind of a supporting role. So perhaps your removal is not fully dead, it can get rid of this Hedron Crab, but your opportunities for counterplay will mostly be, hey, do you have a instant speed answer to this one-shot effect with a narrow window of response, or do you want to have 15 of your cards milled? On the narrative side, for a change, since we mentioned that mill plays the game on a different axis, gameplay-wise, the primary axis being combat for most card games, it also generally has a different theming. Magic's mill is about breaking the opposing mage's mind, in a game primarily about dealing bodily harm via summoned monsters or fireballs, which is an equally compelling way to win for me, but definitely leaves space for personal preference to come into play, resulting in mill being less popular with the player cohort who view that sort of stuff as lame compared to fireballs. Other examples, like Pokemon, may be a bit more suspect. In a game primarily about creature combat, the act of playing the card game being a symbolic representation of the sport of Pokemon fighting, mill represents victory via something else. You're not defeating your opponent's mons per se. The closest approximation of what mill symbolizes in my Great Tusk deck that I can take a guess at is digging a big enough hole. My headcanon is that there is a lesser-known technicality in the Pokemon League's comprehensive rules set that if you dig a big enough hole, the judges have to give you the win. Jokes aside, the Pokemon TCG's theming of mill has been kind of all over the place. We have hole digging on Great Tusk, eating stuff on Durant, we have Charizard GX burning your opponent's cards, which I like, Beware confusing your opponent, I think, and Tyranitar V calling down an avalanche. It's equally as varied from a narrative design standpoint as the ways to deal damage are, but since damage represents, damage, bodily harm, we can easily interpret how fire, avalanches, spraying pressurized water might contribute to damage being dealt. So I think the default put damage on stuff effects have a bit less pressure to justify themselves making sense compared to mill. And potentially the final element here is that mill occasionally requires the opponent to kind of go against the grain when it comes to playing their deck. For example, if my deck generally wants to draw lots of cards fast, cycle through stuff with reckless abandon, just go, go hard. Mill might make me not do that, in order to not run out of cards and cede the victory to them. It might make me adopt a slower pace consciously, and even though the context here is different, I am slowing down to increase my chances of winning, the experience of not drawing cards, equating in my mind to being in a bad position, losing, having a bricked hand, is imprinted in me to the degree that it still might feel bad. Kind of like having a sports car but still having to go the speed limit. You are staying safe, you are avoiding a ticket, but it also kind of feels like you just have a slow car. Hopefully that was a relatable parallel for the droves of sports car drivers in my audience. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, this was the Mill video. Let me know in the comments what your favorite Mill card is, any game, and as always, I'd appreciate a click on some of the YouTube clickables. Thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you in the next one.